The other day, I was sitting with a couple at an early breakfast on Wednesday. At a previous breakfast with them, they had asked me, "Hey, what do you think about living together? What do you think? What's your opinion on living together?" Well, we had about 5 minutes left at that point in time. I said, this conversation may be a little bit more than 4.5 minutes, so let's get together again. And so this last Wednesday, we sat and drank some bad diner coffee, and I didn't say that. We drank some coffee together and just began to go into that conversation. And I said, really, what I believe, what my opinion is really not that important. God's thoughts on it are. So let's look at some scriptures. And we looked at a couple scriptures, and we saw some hard truths that sex outside of marriage. And I assume when they were talking about living together, that they weren't talking about living in separate bedrooms. Okay, made that assumption. And I said, we talked about the hard truths. God sees that sex outside of marriage is wrong, that it is called sexual immorality, and those are some hard things, and may seem in this culture may seem very narrow, may seem very old-fashioned at times, because the number of couples that I'm counseling that are living together is increasing all the time. It seems like each season. But when I got, and there was probably a little bit of a pushback, although they were polite, I could tell, you can tell when someone's just sitting there, you can tell there's kind of something in their spirit that's fighting a little bit. But when I began to talk about the fact that when we trust God and some of His hard truths that He gives us in His life, that when we do that, we begin to experience through that obedience and through that trust, we begin to experience His deep wisdom. We begin to see His plan for our life, why what He says works for us. And not only that, we also begin to experience in new ways His very, very unfailing love, right? And it's amazing as I talked about how God has developed us for intimacy, and how sexual intimacy is kind of the ultimate expression of what a man and woman have as they make a covenant towards one another and towards Him in marriage. Then they begin to soften. They begin to realize, okay, God hadn't just drawn this hard line. There's a reason and purpose for it. Well, last week I shared with you a little bit, if you happen to be here, we're talking about Haggai, as Paul just mentioned a minute ago. And I shared with you that this whole idea for Haggai was not something that just came up a couple weeks ago, that it had actually gone back to September when James and I sat down and said, okay, what do we want to be talking to our people about? What I didn't share with you at that time was that actually this went back further than that, because about this time last summer, I was just reading through the prophets, and I was reading through Haggai, and personally, it's just like this. I read this little 2-chapter book, and it just kind of had this personal response to it of like, whoa, that is some really powerful stuff for me personally on the subject of giving and how I view giving. And I took some things to heart. It made a imprint on my life. And so when James and I talked about in September, hey, he said, I think we need, as we go into the summer, to talk a little bit about giving to our people. I said, let's take a look at Haggai. I think there's some good things there. I think that's important. I want you to know that backstory to why we're here, so you don't just see this teaching, some of this hard things that we've been talking about. As Haggai says, take a hard look. I don't want you to see this as a hammer. I don't want you to see it as like, well, they just pull something out of Scripture so they could jump on us and rebuke us about giving. All right, this is something that God gave me a year ago, and again spoke to me personally. I realize, folks, just the fact that I just said giving. Everybody sat a little bit farther back in their chairs. I realize this, that when we talk about something like giving, that there is going to be a little bit of a pushback. And I recognize that for a couple of reasons. One, because some of you have been in situations. I talked with one of our members just a couple of weeks ago, and they shared with me an experience where they had been in a particular church and particular body of believers, and there was some incredible spiritual abuse going on in their leadership when it came to money. And it was ugly for me to even hear about, and I thought to myself, if I was there, I would understand why when people start talking about giving and money, that there would be an emotional pushback. I get that. Some of you have been there, and if you have not been directly influenced by that in a church, you have certainly read plenty of stories about the abuse of money and giving and skewed teaching on the subject of giving. I get that. But also, I think there's a pushback, and I'm just going to say this because I believe that giving is a hard truth to hear, right? I mean, it is. I mean, it's one of those buttons that for some of us, we're giving, and it's not that big of a deal. But for some of us, we have fought with, I know I should be, but I just can't, or I just won't, or whatever. And so there is that. It's that sensitive button. Like all of us have those in our marriage. We all have those buttons, and giving is kind of, in our walk with Christ, giving can be one of those hard buttons. And it's exactly, I would remind you folks, why God says through Haggai, take a hard look. He doesn't say take a casual look, because he knows this is a hard teaching. He knows this is a tough place in our life. This is some place where there's some defense mechanisms firmly built in, so we are entrenched. And he says to his children through Haggai, take a hard look. So man, before we go on, I just want to encourage you this morning. As I did that young couple, I had the opportunity Wednesday morning to say, man, when dads deep line in the sand commands, those things that seem so tough, that seems like he just draws a line and says, hey, this is my expectation. When we hear those things, but when they are, and we have this pushback, when he is trusted, and those things are obeyed, it leads us to experience his deep wisdom and his unfailing love in a way that we won't. And so as we do that, we understand in his deep failing love, we understand that security comes from that. We understand that that's where our satisfaction comes from. So having said that, let's just jump into Haggai, if you would. If you've got your Bibles, pull those out. If you've got a Bible app, pull it out. We're going to just walk through this last chapter or so of Haggai, all right? Haggai gives us four very powerful images when it comes to this idea of trusting him enough to realize that we need to be giving to him, all right? And we're going to look at those four powerful images. In a lot of ways, they speak for themselves. The first one is this. It is one he calls pockets filled with holes. Now, we talked about this just a little bit last week. It comes in the first chapter, actually, in 6 through 8. You have planted much, but harvest little. You eat, but are not satisfied. You drink, you're still thirsty. You put on clothes, but you cannot keep warm. Your wages disappear as though you were putting them in pockets filled with holes. Pockets filled with holes. When you think about pockets filled with, you think about that phrase, what do you think about? Pockets filled with keys, pockets filled with change, pockets filled with something valuable that I'm putting in my pocket so I can save it for another day so I can have it. And it's interesting that Haggai uses the word filled with, okay? He doesn't say your pockets have holes. He says your pockets are filled with holes. They're not filled with any of the things that you've been trying to do for satisfaction. They are filled with holes. Makes me think of when my boys were growing up, they had this little friend, a little young man who actually grew up in our church. And John liked pancakes. And John ate pancakes a lot for breakfast. This when he was a pretty small little codger. And John sometimes would come over to our house later in the day to play with the boys, or I guess reportedly he would go to school. And he liked those pancakes so much that after he ate those pancakes, whatever was left, he would stuff those pancakes right down in his pockets. That's not a pretty sight. But the boys every once in a while would be, they'd be in the middle of a ball game or in the middle of playing whatever boys were playing at the time. And John would take his little fingers and he would put them down in his pockets, and I guess a little hungry for snack time mid-morning. And out he would pull his little grimy little fingers filled with whatever's left, the pancake, complete with syrup and butter. Pockets filled with whatever. See, this pocket's filled with holes. This is the lie of self-reliance. It's the lie of self-reliance. It is internally, although we would never verbalize it, is internally. We are saying, if it is to be, it's up to, that's right. And that's a lie. That's a lie. That's not the Father speaking to us. That is not the Father speaking to us. This requires a vulnerability to God that says, no, if it's to be, it is up to God. All right? He will provide. I like the way Craig Rochelle of Life Church says it. It says, sometimes when we have this lie of self-reliance in our life, it is like we are believing in God, but like we are living like He doesn't exist. Is that true of you? We confess His name, we speak His name. Oh yeah, I believe He owns the cattle, all those kind of things. But we live like it's up to me. I'm reminded in Luke 12 about the rich fool who fills his barns, and he has more and better crops, and he goes, I know what I will do. I'll just build bigger barns and better barns and fill them also. And I was reminded of, as I was reading that there are 9 times in that very short story, 9 times, folks, that he mentions the word I or me, but never the name of God. Self-reliance. If my future, secure future is to be, it is up to me. If I'm going to get what I really, really want, it is up to me. I was reminded the other day, I'm at that point in time when you really begin to think about retirement down the road and what that looks like and if you're ready. And I've had this figure in my mind for quite some time. But I thought, you know what, if we can get to that point in time, if we can get to that amount, whatever, that would be a great thing. And I think that would absolutely be enough for us to live, I hate the word comfortably, but that would pay the bills, that would allow us to do what we want to do. The interesting thing happened the other day. I sat down with a friend of mine who I use for some financial and planning advice. And I shot that number out at him. And all of a sudden, I realized this. All of a sudden, within about 10 minutes, I was like, yeah, but if I increased my giving to this, or if I increased my savings, how much would it take for me to get to this level? And I realized that all of a sudden, I was beginning to find security, something that had seemed a few years ago would have seemed like plenty. All of a sudden, I'm thinking, no, really, to be secure, I need this amount. And the point from that is that this self-reliance sneaks up on us, folks. It does not bang at the door. It sneaks up on us. And I would tell you that it sneaks up on us, holding hands with 2 things. Holding hands with prosperity and holding hands with age. As we get older, we have a tendency to begin to grab on and put our hands on the levers of security more and more as we think about our later days. And it's a funny thing that sometimes you would think that poorer people struggle with the security thing. But actually, I have found and seen that actually as we prosper, we actually begin to want and desire and cling to more. And the truth is, it's on God. Finish this phrase. The Lord is my shepherd. That's right. We're not all familiar with a whole lot of the Bible, but that's one we're familiar with, right? The Lord is my shepherd. The NLV says, I have all that I need. I have all that I need. And I would remind you that there are no ninja warrior sheep. Think about that a second. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever seen a ninja warrior sheep before? A sheep that could take care of itself. A sheep with a mighty fighting spirit. A sheep that said, I don't need anybody. I got this for myself. Bring on the next activity. Bring on the next event. The reason that David uses sheep and the picture of a shepherd is to get to paint a picture for us of something that's completely dependent upon something else. The Lord is my shepherd. I have all that I need. Folks, before we go to the next image, let me just remind you that we are surrounded, and you have worked amongst, and some of you are the victims of this flood and have been directly or indirectly influenced by it. We have an interesting, very, very rare and interesting opportunity here. One is to serve those who have been left with nothing. And two is as we work, that we would sit back and watch over time, that those people who have nothing, those people whose every last fork and t-shirt and underwear has been taken from them and they are starting from the floor, we have an opportunity to watch our God provide for them, and provide He will. It does not rely upon us. He is the shepherd of those who have been flooded out. And folks, He will provide. And we can allow it to be some great lessons for us if we'll do that. The second image is found in Haggai 2:1. Haggai 2:1 says, "Then on October 17th of that same year, the Lord sent another message through the prophet Haggai." Where's the image, you say? Well, the image is actually found in the date. Because October 17th, all right, is probably not, unless it's your birthday or whatever, okay, it's probably not a date that you celebrate. But for the Jew, October 17th was right in the middle of a festival called the Festival of Booths, or the Festival of Shelters. And this was a festival, that we find in Leviticus, I believe, 23, all right? And what it basically says is that this was a festival, one of several. First, it came at the end of the second harvest for the Jews. This was something that God said. At the end of the second harvest, on this particular week of this particular month, I want you to celebrate for 7 days. I want you to fast, and then I want you just to celebrate with your children. I want it to be a time of hope and joy. Here's what you're celebrating. You are celebrating the fact that so many years ago, I took you and your people, and I took you out of bondage and delivered you out of Egypt. And I took you through the wilderness and the desert land into a promised land. Here's what I want you to do. This is very interesting. He said, for 7 days, your families are to go out and build booths or shelters, temporary small shelters. And for 7 days, you and your family are supposed to live in those. Okay? Leave your regular house. When the festival of booths or shelters comes, take some stuff, go down, take some different branches from some of the different trees, and build this temporary shelter and live there for 7 days as a reminder that all these years ago, that when you came out of Egypt, I had you living in those same types of shelters. This will be a reminder for you and your children. I was listening to a Jew by the name the other day, an Orthodox Jew by the name of Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro has some great, very, very good commentary on what is going on in our nation and our world today. I would encourage you to dial him up. This particular one, he had kind of left that, and he was being asked by the person who ran the podcast to talk about some of the Jewish festivals. And so he began to plunge into some of the festivals he remembered as a kid. And he talked about the feast of the festival of booths. He said, for me as a kid, it was great. He said it was like when you're a kid, you get to live in a tent in the backyard for a few days. He said it was so exciting. But he said, even as a child, he said, what began to be taught to me and what I began to catch was this, that this life is not one of permanence. That the booths were a reminder, this is temporary. You go down to the riverside or whatever, you cut some tree limbs, you make something, everybody knows it's only for 7 days. And he said, I began to realize that there was more to this life than just the 50 or 70 or 80 years that God gave me on this earth. He said, it was also a reminder to me as a child that I was on a journey. And it was also a reminder that when God would say go to the Israelites, they could basically knock down the shelter and be on their way. That there wasn't anything particularly they had to pack up. Isn't that exciting? I thought that was pretty interesting. And so the image for us is of this out of 2:1 is this festival of shelters is that God wants you and I as His children. He calls us to make sure in our life that we are not living like this is all there is. That we are remembering this is a journey, and the journey is as important as the destination. And that when He says go, we can go. And folks, this is the lie. Believing this is the lie that ties us down. The first was the lie of self-reliance. This is the lie that ties us down, that it weighs us down because we get so indebted to people. We're buying this and that, and we're surrounding ourselves with things, and we have payments on them, and we have maintenance on them, and we get weighted down to this earth. And our thoughts have to be on like, oh, when do I have to pay the bank? When is the mortgage due? When's the car payment due? When's that, whatever that, something that's already worn out but I still owe on it, when's that due? When's the credit card due? And we are so caught up in looking around at the things we have to maintain and pay for that we cannot be caught up, and our thoughts cannot be caught up in the things of heaven. So folks, listen, man, when God said, go to the Israelites, what happened? When God said go, what happened? You know, the teenage son came out and kicked down the walls, the branches of the shelter, and they were on their way. It's kind of like the Minutemen of the Revolutionary War. And let me encourage us. I want you to think about this. Wouldn't you like to be in a place, and many of you have, where when this flood happened, haven't you thought to yourself, man, I wish I could do more. I wish I could give more. Man, I wish I had that $1,000 or that $500 or that $50 or whatever in the bank that I could just help somebody out. That I could be there. And I think this image and the principle that's there is a Minuteman type of living. That we've lived in a way that we have not surrounded ourselves with those things, and so we are freed from those things. We are delivered from that out of that financial Egypt, and we are able to, when those needs arise, we are there and we can go, hey, I see that you have a need. We would like to help. And it might be $5. And it might be $500. For some of you, it might be $5,000. I don't know. That's all relative. And God doesn't care about that amount, only that we are able to give sacrificially and that we have placed ourselves in a position because of the temporary tabernacles that we have built, that we are ready to go on. Now, beyond the first two images, if you look in the passage, there's a couple harsh realities. And reality one is found in Haggai 2:3. And it says this, does anyone remember this house, this temple in its former splendor? How in comparison does it look to you now? It must seem like nothing at all. So here's what's happened. If you remember from the first chapter, the people had been building their own fine or paneled houses, right? And God says, why are you building your own fine houses and mine lies in ruins? And the people, in a rare moment of obedience for the children of God, had said, you know what, you're right, God. And so they begin to build the temple. And so this is a couple months later, and God says, how does this look to you? It's like he reads their minds. And so they're a couple months into this building. They know what the old temple looked like and how magnificent it was, and they're just building this thing, and that, maybe the bricks or whatever are this high. And maybe it's just they don't have the resources that they had before. And so what has happened? They have become discouraged in their work. And here's what God says. He says, folks, listen. Keep going. Keep working. I am here. And let's just call a time out here a second and take a breath. And you and I just recognize that anytime we start talking again about giving and we start actually making the decision that we are going to give, that it's going to be tough sometimes because that hasn't been a part of our budget. And sometimes, God is always going to come through, but he probably will not come through on your or mine timetable. I have learned that by experience. I was counting on something the other day financially, and I was counting on it pretty heavy. The track record was that it would be there, and it was a pretty significant chunk that I was counting on, and got to that, and that didn't come through. And I was driving down the road thinking, come on, God. I thought, man, you had this thing worked out. And I think he kind of whispered like, no, you had it worked out. You never asked me about it. I got a plan, but it's not your plan. So sometimes nostalgia or sometimes the expectations of the future can cause us discouragement. I talked to kind of an interesting thing. I was literally just driving yesterday to the office to finish this up, my sermon, Friday. I guess it was Friday morning. And I stopped by at one of our a business of one of our members, and we got talking about. And I said, "Man, I'm going to talk about giving Sunday. If you want to decide to skip now." And he started talking about his giving, and this is what he said. He said, "Man," he said, "when we started giving, Steve, when we started giving, how do you think the rest of the sentence was?" He said, "When we started giving, it got tough." He said, "It was like God testing us. You really going to do this? You really going to believe in me and lean on me?" He said, "I'm telling you, it was tough." But then he said, then I realized the next month that my sales had already increased. And he said, it's like one of the things I didn't connect them. But he said, when it first happened, when he first started giving, it was tough. And I just remind you, folks, sometimes we do get discouraged. And God says to these people, "I am with you. And with my presence comes everything you need." And he says continue to work, but he doesn't say work to complete the temple. He doesn't say work to provide a way of living for yourself. He says work because I am here. Dawn was telling me the other day, she had worked in the preschool area, and she was trying to get the attention of all these kids, and this one little boy above the hubbub was trying to get her attention. And said all the kids were talking, and said this one little 4-year-old finally looked at her, and said he pointed at her, and he did this. He said, "Hey, eyes right here." And she said, "I bet you're the child of a coach." And he said, let me just tell you, folks, listen. When we're down and we're in the building and we're doing the tough things about life and we're trying to be obedient to Him and we're deciding we're going to give, there's going to be some discouraging times, and we can easily get our eyes around all the bills and all the payments and all the things that say you can't keep doing this. And God says, "Look at me. You, look at me. Don't look at this. You look at me. I am here and I am with you." Third powerful image. Third powerful image, he starts and he says, "I'm going to shake the heavens. I'm going to shake the treasuries of all the government." And then in 2:8 he says this, "The silver is mine and the gold is mine, says the Lord of heaven's armies." This is the lie of ownership. God says, you don't have enough resources for the temple? You're discouraged because you don't think it's going to be enough. It's not going to be as much splendor and beauty as before. He says, "I'm going to shake the treasuries of the nations. I'm going to overthrow governments, and I'm going to make sure that this is even better than the last one." And then he says, the silver and the gold, those things that the temple had been filled with, those things that everybody on earth recognizes as the two most valuable resources. He says, the silver and the gold, they're mine. Folks, the "it's mine" mindset may be, by percentages, the one we most struggle with. Owner versus manager. We want to believe that because we have worked so hard for it. And he talks about this in Haggai chapter 1. He says, you have worked so hard for it, I'm going to blow it away. Just to show you that just because you worked for it does not mean you own it. You worked for it, and I still cause those crops to grow. And folks, if you think about just for a second, think about anybody on this earth being the owner of something, and they come and they give it. I mean, they place it in your hands. Okay? They're the owner, and they place it in your hands just to say, hey, this is mine, but I want you to be able to use it. I want you to be able to benefit from it. And they come back next month and they say, hey, by the way, hey, I'd like that. I would like that back now, okay? And imagine the ridiculousness of us saying, no, I'll give you a little bit of it. I'll give you a little bit of it, but I'm not going to give you the whole thing. It's in my hands now. I reached out. You placed it in my hands. Isn't that ridiculous to think about? And yet God, who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and he owns the gold, and he owns the silver, and he allows us to use these things out of his incredible benevolence, he allows us to use these things. And yet when he says, hey, I'd like you to give the first 10% back to me, what do we do? Isn't it weird what our response is to that? Like, whoa, well, really? You expect 10%? It's all his. It's all God's. But God not only says it's mine, but he says the future glory of this temple will be greater than the past. And in this place I will bring peace. And I don't have a lot of time to just pull this out as much as I'd like to, but just let me say this. If it came down to it, I don't think personally that this thing of ownership is necessarily because of greed or what we might say materialism for most of us. I think it's the fact that we believe we have to have that to pay the bills and do whatever we need to do so we can have peace for our life. I really think that's the bottom line issue in this, more than materialism and that kind of thing for most of us. And God says, listen, the gold and the silver are mine. They're mine. I'm going to bring, my presence is going to bring you the peace that you really desire. But there's a hard reality, number two, and it's simply the case of disobedience. And God just says, hey, listen, if you've obeyed, but just as a reminder, if you do not obey me, be reminded of what I told you in chapter 1. And he kind of goes back through chapter 1 again. And he says, listen, you were eating but not satisfied. You were drinking but not thirsty. You were doing all those things and you had nothing. Just a little reminder, we all have to do that to our children, even on good days. The harsh reminder that if when we choose to disobey, God will not come through consistently. But the people have become obedient. They've trusted the promise. And so this fourth powerful image is here. He says in 2:19, he says, I am giving you a promise now while the seed is still in the barn. Catch that? Okay, don't let that one get past you. I'm giving you a promise while the seed is still in the barn. You've not even harvested your grain or your grapevines or your fig trees or your pomegranates and your olive trees. They have not yet produced their crops. But from this day onward, I will bless you. This is the lie that I can control circumstances. And God is saying, regardless of whether the sun shines, whether it rains too much, whether the soil is right, all those things are right, regardless of that. He says, the seed is still in the barn. You have no idea whether there's going to be a good crop or not, but I'm just telling you, there's going to be a good crop because I'm going to bless you because of your obedience from this day forward. Can you believe that? I mean, really? Can you believe that if we decide to trust him and be obedient, that he is able to look past into the future, way, way far past what we can, which is about 3 seconds, and he is able to produce a crop, produce abundantly for us, and take care of our needs even before the seed has been placed in the soil. There's 4 powerful images, folks. And I think God is saying, take a hard look. Take a hard look. God says to us through those images, it doesn't rely on you. It doesn't rely on you. Quit acting like you believe it relies on you. Quit giving like you believe it relies on you. He says, I am your shepherd. He says in another image, it's not about this place. There is so much more. There's a future and an eternity. There's a promised land, and there's the kingdom of God that must go ahead. People must hear the gospel. He says, you are on a journey. He says also another image, it's not yours, it's mine. Fourth image, he says, I am in control, and if you'll obey, I will bless. Let me say this, and something you know already, and that is that God, it's not this like we give money and he gives money back. We give money and he gives more money back. It's not that way. I mean, sometimes we give money and things may be thinner. We may not get everything we want, but there's something he brings to our life, sometimes non-tangibles. He brings healing to relationship. He brings physical healing. He brings a satisfaction that we can't maybe put our hand on, but if we'll think about it long enough, we'll know it's there. Sometimes my dad used to talk about, when they began to tithe, he said we couldn't afford it, but we did it. And he said we realized after a year that we had had no medical bills whatsoever with 3 kids. And he said we knew that was a God thing. Now I want to, just in those last couple minutes, I want to make this really practical. Because anytime we have something hard, it's really easy to be vague, right? So here's if you got a pen or a pencil, or you want to write this in your phone or whatever, and put some notes, some space for notes in here. I want to talk for just as I close. I want to talk about vagueness. Vagueness. What God is calling you and I to do, folks, is to trust him. And whether we want to believe it or not, and it is a hard thing to look at, when we have chosen not to give what is already his, it is a matter of trust. We are trusting something, and we are refusing to trust him that he will take care of us. It is always a matter of trust. And if we aren't trusting, there's probably some type of a fear there. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is this. I'm going to ask you to get past the vagueness of that fear. Fears are often vague, and it's hard to put our finger on them, but we can't deal with them until we actually put our finger exactly on what that fear is. I want you to write down one fear-filled thought that comes to mind when you think about giving. One fear-filled thought that comes to mind when you think about giving. Some of you are giving already. You're giving maybe less than 10%, all right? I'm no judge of that. That's something between you and God. What comes to your mind if you're giving a smaller amount? What comes to your mind? What's one fear-filled thought when you are challenged by God to give the tithes, to give 10% of what He has blessed you with? Maybe some of you are tithing. So what is one fear-filled thought when you think about bumping it up another notch? Let's just be honest. I mean, just write down. What is that thought? It's like, oh man, we couldn't afford, we couldn't pay for. What is that fear-filled thought? Second thing I want you to write down is, I want you to write down one desire. This will be even tougher. One desire or want that you have that you believe would not be obtained if you give. That's where the rubber meets the road. We have something that we desire, something that we want, and there's something in us that believes that if we give, I'm not going to be able to get what I want. So let's just be honest with ourselves and with the Spirit. What is the one thing that you believe that you want or desire? Then if you bump it up and you begin to give, maybe more sacrificially, that you might not get that. Okay? Last thing. Of those 4 images, what is your mindset? Which one of those mindsets do you struggle with? The lie. Which lie do you struggle with? That it's up to you, the lie of self-reliance. That I'm here to stay, the lie of permanence. That it's mine, the lie of ownership. Or that maybe I've just been so disobedient, He would never bless me. Which one of those 4 is really the one that just hammers you? I want you to know, maybe you're relatively new here in this church. I want you to know this. that Boulevard is committed to a number of things, but two of the things you need to know we are committed to is one, we are committed incredibly to fiscal responsibility. One of our elders said just the other day to me, Steve, we are stewards of God's money and we have to be wise in the way we use it. And I was reminded again, our leadership is committed to that. You may not be able to trust me, but I hope that you can. We are committed to that, to fiscal responsibility, because we know it's God's, and we want to be wise with that. And the other second thing we're committed to is we're committed to the good news, taking the good news of Jesus Christ to this community and to the world. And I say unashamedly that takes resources. And so if you, as you give, you can give knowing that that money will be taken care of and will be used with wisdom as we ask God, what do you want us to do? And it will be used to change lives with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you, Ruth. Trust me. Trust me. Maybe you're not even a believer, and God says to you what that 4-year-old said to my wife. You, right here. He's saying, look at me and trust my love and trust what I've done for you through my son, sending him to die so that your sin could be taken from you so that you could be in relationship with me. Look hard at me, he says. Trust me.